Hey everyone, welcome to Exploring Health, Macro to Micro. I'm your host, Parker Condit. In this show, I interview experts from all areas of health. This can be in areas you might expect, like exercise, nutrition, and mental health, while others may be topics that come from areas that you're less familiar with. Today's episode is all about farming, food supply, and regenerative agriculture. These are all topics that have become very important to me over the past few months, as you can probably tell with the frequency that this topic is coming up. Here to discuss that with me is Sander Van Stee. Sander is the founder of Moral Eats, a family-owned farm in Canada. So within the world of regenerative agriculture, there are many tactics and strategies that can be implemented to move from traditional farming to regenerative practices. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and it's as much art as it is science. So this conversation goes into some of the struggles of making that transition, both the struggles from the farming side and then also things that are challenging on the consumer side as well. And one of the biggest ones is consumer behavior. Many people will say that they want better farming practices, healthier soil, regenerative transition, but then they don't change their buying behaviors and continue to buy what is the cheapest or the most convenient. And given the economic environment, I understand why, but it makes this a very tricky topic. So we as consumers cannot allow the entire weight and responsibility and the financial burden to fall on the producers. Hopefully, this conversation will shed some light on why and what we can do to help. This is a longer episode, so it's going to be split into two parts. This will be part one, and part two will be released later this week. So without further delay, please enjoy part one of my conversation with Sander Van Stee. Sander, thanks so much for being here. Just for context, most people coming to this show, or listeners coming to this show, are coming from a health perspective. So I think, or they want to be healthy. So I think the easiest place to start is getting an understanding of regenerative agriculture, which is going to be probably the main theme of this whole conversation, framed around the idea of why is that healthier than conventional agriculture or traditional farming in that sense?
Yeah, so regenerative agriculture, put very simply, is simply farming in a way that emphasizes soil health over basically everything else, whereas commercial agriculture is more so focused on profitability and lowering costs, because that is the demand that most farmers are supplying. The demand from the average consumer is to have the cheapest food possible. If you're going to the grocery store, most people just buy the package of ground beef that's 10 cents cheaper than the one beside it. So that's what commercial agriculture is. They're supplying that demand. But regenerative agriculture is a little bit different. And to add a layer of complexity to that explanation, what you're really trying to manage and improve is the microbial life in the soil. And what the plant can do when you have an amazing diversity of microbial life in the soil is that it can actually excrete sugars in exchange for nutrients. So it can get nutrients on demand from the microbial life in the soil. It's a very beautiful system. And like, to make this work, you need the fungal life, which is usually the limiting factor in making this whole system work. But like, because the bacteria are quite often there, maybe not as diverse as it could be in an ideal situation. But then it's not just that. You need the nematodes, which are your worms, and the arthropods, which are your insects. And you have this very complex food chain. And what happens is, in commercial agriculture, we use things like synthetic fertilizers, or we cause compaction with our massive equipment, or we use typical monocrops, and that lack of diversity does not stimulate the diversity of microbial life in the soil. And what we end up with is a system where the plants need fertilizers in order to grow, because the microbial population is not there. So then if you don't use fertilizer, the plant doesn't grow, so you can't grow a crop. So you are required to use fertilizer in many of these situations. And even the act of using synthetic fertilizer actually creates that addiction to fertilizer itself, because if the plant is getting the nutrients that it requires from synthetic fertilizers, it no longer needs it from the microbial life. So then it doesn't excrete the sugars, and those sugars are the base food source of that whole food chain. So then that food chain collapses. And always the first thing to go are the fungal life. They are the most sensitive to any sort of disturbance. And that's what is the most difficult to to manage in a way that is thriving. And there's one species of fungal life in particular that is critical, is a keystone species, and that is the mycorrhizal fungi. And what they do, they're basically long filamental fungus, which embed in the roots of the plants and reach out into the soil and transport the sugars from the plants and the nutrients back to the plants. It's critical for making this whole system work. But basically what happens when you're using synthetic fertilizer, the plant grows. It might not thrive in the absolute sense. It might not be reaching its full potential, but it's still a growing plant that produces a crop and gives you lots of food. But the plant is only getting the nutrients that you're adding as synthetic fertilizer, because it no longer has that relationship with the microorganisms. It can no longer ask for all the tiny little micronutrients in the soil. And you can never fertilize for every single micronutrient that you can be found in the soil. So the end result is plants that are grown that have less micronutrients. They have less nutritional value. And as a result, they're also less healthy. So you have plants that are less healthy, which could be like your fruits and your vegetables or your cereal grains. You have animals eating those plants that are now also less nutrient dense, less healthy, which are like your beef and whatever animal products you have. And it works its way all the way up the food chain to our plate, where the food that we're eating is less nutrient dense. It is less healthy because and it is not just theory. You can measure this. It's been measured. There's a new movement towards something called metabolomic research, which is like testing where you're measuring all the metabolites, all of the breakdown products from metabolism, from digesting food. And if you measure those, you can compare different products. So if you look at the regeneratively raised products that are rotationally grazed, like your grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and you compare that to your grain-finished beef, not necessarily all that surprising, but there's actually less evidence of aging in the animals that are raised with on just grass, that are grass-fed and grass-finished. There's less proteolysis, there's less oxidative stress, there's less glycation end products, all signs of aging. And then that translates into the meat, the metabolites of those meats. So it translates into more nutrition. You have more, as far as the actual meat that you're eating, it has more antioxidants, it has more vitamin A, vitamin E, has a better fatty acid profile. There's more omega-3 fatty acids. But interestingly, or in my opinion is more interesting, is that it's also a great source of phytonutrients, or the nutrients that originate from plants. Grass-fed, grass-finished meat is actually an excellent source of these plant-derived nutrients. And there's a long list of different phytonutrients, but basically they all have antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties, and they're found in large quantities.
Yeah, I appreciate that initial explanation of regenerative farming, and we're going to end up diving into this a lot throughout the conversation. I do want to end up kind of getting more into the nitty gritty of soil health at some point, and also kind of get into this other stuff of understanding the fungal diversity requirements within soil. How do you restore that? What happens more in depth when you start using these fertilizers? And you already kind of mentioned it. It's sort of this ongoing wheel where once you start using it, then the soil is not going to be regenerating itself. So you need to keep using it. So it's sort of this vicious cycle. And you see why once we started that, we had to keep going, because it seems really dangerous and counterintuitive. But if I'm not using this, I know I'm not going to get a crop yield. And then farming at the end of the day is still an industry. It's a business, and you need yield, you need profit, or you need revenue at least, to keep going. So you can see logically how we ended up here, and then also understanding the economic impact of, we need to feed a lot of people, right? There's the population's been growing. I think it's actually declining now, but up until this point, we have needed a very massive food supply. So you can see how we got here, and that's fine. But now I think it's the education piece. It's informing people of the downside of kind of going against nature for so long. Not even so long in the grand scheme of things. It's been 60 some years of this type of farming, this really industrial farming. So now it's educating people to the downsides of that and what the shift has to be towards a more sustainable and a better future when it comes to agriculture. But I do want to get us like a better understanding for understanding your operation. So if you could describe where you are, and then anything you want to give people like size wise, like how many acres do you have? What row crops do you have? How many cows, turkeys, anything like that. Just give us an idea of sort of the operation. And also love to know how many people are working there. Cause I was, looking up a lot of your videos and like seeing the scope of this. I'd love to know like how many people are required to keep an operation like this going.
Yeah, I grew up on a commercial dairy farm. That's my background. And so that's where I'm coming from. And there's been generations of dairy farmers in my family on both sides of my family, my mom's and my dad's side of the family. So yeah, there's huge value in that generational knowledge, but there's also a lot of shortcomings because you get stuck in doing things in the way that they've always been done. So like it's kind of like give and take. So like going down the road that I'm going now is quite challenging because I really have to relearn things, and relearning things and unlearning things is far more difficult than learning things in the first place. So it's been a real mind bend for me. But what we have is we have 700 acres in Ontario. My family immigrated to Ontario from the Netherlands, and we have 700 acres today, and it's not all workable. This may be somewhere around 600 acres workable, but we do most of the acres is used for feeding our dairy herd. We have so that's mostly corn silage and haylage, but we do some cash cropping as well. We have your typical rotation where we have grain, corn, soy, wheat, and some cover cropping in there when we can. But that's basically where I came from, and then the direction I'm heading is a whole different story. I have that commercial agriculture background, but I'm heading towards regenerative agriculture. So I have some of the crossbreds from our dairy herd. Their bottom end of our dairy cows are being bred to beef, and because they're half beef, half dairy, I can actually finish them on grass. I can raise them as grass-fed, grass-finished beef, which actually wouldn't be possible, or it would be far more expensive if they were 100% dairy, because dairy cows are bred to produce milk, not to put on muscle and fat. So that beef genetics makes this whole transition much more possible for me. So I'm keeping some of those bull calves, those crossbreds. They're half Angus, half Holstein, and I'm raising them as grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And I'm doing it on a relatively small scale because the limiting factor to making this transition possible is finding that demand, is actually finding the customers and selling the products. Because like you said earlier, we're running a business, and as idealistic as I naturally am, I'm slapped in the face with reality every single day. And if I don't pay the bills, I owe an awful lot of money to our banker. And if I don't make those payments, I'm going to lose the farm. So like, where will regenerative agriculture be if there's no profitability? There's no sustainability without profitability. So it's a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. So I'm starting on a smaller scale. We planted some pasture, and we had the grass-fed, grass-finished beef grazing that pasture. And then behind those, we actually have turkey following on the exact same pasture, just 3 days behind. And that 3 days is ideal because around that time, that's when like the fly larvae and the insects, they start to hatch that are attracted to the manure from the grass-fed beef. And then the turkeys can actually eat that. They can eat those insects, and they can supplement their diet along with the pasture and the supplemental feed that we offer them. So yeah, that's essentially where we're at.
Great. So I think you're already starting to paint the picture of how these various aspects of your operation start to work together. But for anyone who's unfamiliar, can you maybe like juxtapose I'm trying to find the right term, concentrated animal feeding operation for beef, like what that looks like versus the pasture, like having them sort of graze pastures as they're doing on your farm. And then how does that tie in? You already started to get into it with the turkeys that follow. I just want to be able to paint a picture for people to understand, be like, how do all these different aspects tie together And then if you weren't grazing these animals, what would normally be happening? Probably monocropping those pastures or cash cropping those pastures. So if you can just speak to sort of how those things start to tie together, that'd be great.
Yeah, so like in general, commercial agriculture, there's a real push towards specialization and efficiencies. Whereas regenerative agriculture is kind of like a return to generalization, which comes with its own challenges because you need a far larger knowledge base to make all these different industries work on your farm, all these different flows of income, which is great to have more flows of income because you're safer basically that way. You have those more diverse sources of income, but yeah, there's more challenges because there's that knowledge base is massive that you need to know. But so like what you typically see as far as on the beef side is very specialized. You have one farmer that does the cow calf is what it's typically called, and those farmers quite often or usually do have their cows out on pasture. They usually are like a low input kind of system, and then they have a beef bull walking in amongst their cows, so they have those calves every year, and they're really pushing towards having that single calf every single year from those beef cows, and then once those calves are weaned off from their mothers, then they usually go to the next farm, typically. And then on the next farm, that farmer is specialized in growing these animals. And they still need a lot of roughage. Quite often they're still raised on pasture, actually. Not always, but they still need a lot of roughage. You can't get them fat too early because you want them to grow that frame out as well before you add fat to it. And then typically after that is that farmer then will sell these grower beef animals over to the finisher. And that finisher might have them for 2, 3 months, and they're fed a heavy grain diet for those last couple of months, lots of carbohydrates, and that grain diet. They have very little roughage, just enough to keep them healthy, and they put on fat in a hurry. And then you're able to have these animals. They have a decent amount of frame. They put on that fat really fast, and you're able to send them off. They're finished. They're ready to go at about 15 to 16 months of age. And then if you compare that to the grass fed, grass finished, more often it is one farmer doing the whole process. Not always, but typically that they are because they're smaller scale operations. And it's also, like I said, there's the whole more of a holistic system typically. So usually you have the guy, they have their own calves. They have their own mother cows. They're raising the calves right up until finishing on just their pasture. And in order to even have a chance of fattening these animals, you have to do rotational grazing just to keep the quality of that feed higher. And that's in contrast to continual grazing, which you can get away with when you're just having like the mother cows or you're just trying to grow their frame. Continual grazing is when you have a massive pasture and they have access to this pasture for months at a time, and they're constantly grazing throughout this whole pasture. Whereas rotational grazing is where there's daily moves. You concentrate them to a smaller area, and every single day you're moving them to fresh pasture, and the pasture they leave behind gets a chance to rest and recover. And that's critical for regenerating the soil as well, because it's in recovering that you're building the health of that soil. So that's typically what you see. And then also because the pasture is less caloric dense, it's than just almost entirely grain diet of soy and corn and whatever other grains. It takes longer to finish them. So typically a grass-fed, grass-finished animal is not ready to go. It's not ready to be slaughtered until they're 24, 25, 26 months old. So that's where quite often the extra expenses, the extra cost of production comes from. It's the fact that these animals are so much longer. You're feeding them for more days. So that's typically why the grass-fed finished products are more expensive. Yeah, and then depends. Everybody's doing it differently. There's not a one way or one size fits all when it comes to regenerative agriculture. But because of that push towards generalization, you end up finding ways that these different animals and these different income sources can complement each other really, really well. And it's almost exciting just to find more and more ways that these different animals and these different aspects of a farm can complement each other, and we can learn from nature in a lot of these ways. Like if you look at the massive herds of bison that used to roam across North America, there would always be birds following in behind them. And like the water buffalo, it's so common to see a photo of a water buffalo with like the egret sitting on its shoulders. They complement each other because the like for us, we do turkeys, and the turkeys don't like walking through tall grass that they should get stuck because the grass is taller than they are. So the beef, they eat the grass shorter, so the turkeys can actually manage to graze it themselves, and then the manure left behind is a source of nutrition itself, but also attracts more insects, which is an extra source of nutrition for these birds. So that's already a lot of way that they're complementing each other. But then also the turkeys, their manure is quite unique when you compare it to cattle. The manure from poultry is much higher in nitrogen, and grass thrives on nitrogen. So the nitrogen from the turkey manure boosts the growth, the fertility of this pasture for when the beef herd comes back around and returns to that same piece of pasture after it's recovered. And now they have that extra growth from that nitrogen. So then they're benefiting from the turkeys as well. And then also the farmer benefits because you need, like I was saying earlier, there's no sustainability, there's no future for regenerative agriculture without profitability. And when you start stacking these different enterprises, you have multiple sources of income on the same acreage of pasture. The turkeys are grazing, they're grazing the exact same pasture, the exact same land as the beef are. No extra land required. So it's great that way too. And then that's also like, yeah, like blending, you can have add in pork. They can complement things like, and then cash cropping too. Like you can have cash cropping, and then you can have your cover crops afterwards with animals can graze that. So cash cropping systems can complement the animals and adding the animals back into the environment. So like there's so many different ways. There's almost endless possibilities of the way these different sources of income or these different enterprises can complement each other.
Yeah, I can imagine being creative is almost a requirement, but almost you probably almost get paralyzed with the amount of options of different things that you can end up trying and experimenting with. So I'm sure there is somewhat like tried and true methods as to what you can do, but then you always have the flexibility of working within, the land that you're in, the environment, the requirements of what you need to do from like a revenue perspective, and then also like the skill and the expertise of the farmer. That's why you get all these different options. I am curious. So you said the beef will graze, then the turkeys will come in and graze behind it. How often, like what's the timeline between when the beef will come back around to that same piece of pasture?
The beef will come back around, and well, it depends how much moisture you're getting, but typically around 6 weeks. So earlier in the season, in the spring, it'll be quicker. It'll be a faster turnaround. Later in the season, if you have, especially if you have dry spells, you have to slow the animals down, and then it'll be longer before you return. But yeah, so that's the beef. But turkeys, which complement things, or so that makes things a little more complex. They actually don't return to the same piece of pasture because you're trying to avoid parasites. So the recommendation out there is that you basically don't return to the same pasture with turkeys for at least 2 years. So you give a whole year rest before you return with birds.
Interesting. See, learning so much. One of the other things I wanted to know is you've already talked about how you're transitioning from, what was like a commercial dairy farm to trying to get to a more regenerative place. Obviously, you can't do this overnight. Like, do you have a plan as to, or can you maybe describe like when you started and when you expect to be fully transitioned over, and just speak to generally the amount of time that it's going to take an operation of your size to get there?
Yeah, as far as how long it'll take, I don't really see it as a finish line. I see it as a journey that will never end. I feel like you constantly have to move towards improving your management practices to become more regenerative. I don't think it's like on off, you're regenerative or you're not. I feel like it's a direction that you're trying. It's a new focus, new emphasis for your farm. So there will always be room for improvement, in my opinion. And then as far as our operation, I'm starting with things on a smaller scale, like I mentioned, with the turkeys and the beef, and then growing. The limiting factor for me is really the size of the customer base, because our dairy farm is a decent size. We milk 180 cows, and so it's a full herd of 400 animals or more. So that's a lot, that's a decent sized operation for our area in Canada, Ontario. It's well above average size. So that amount of milk, it's very intimidating to try to find customers for all those products. So starting on a smaller scale with the beef and with the turkey, all that the meat, it is basically a good way for me to dip my toes, learn the skills needed for marketing and finding customers, and then from there, once we build up that customer base, I want to grow to the point where we keep 100% of our bull calves. We don't keep all of them yet. I really, really want to, but we don't have that customer base yet. So that'll grow first. The beef and the turkey will grow and grow, and then once I have that foundation of the demand for these products, for these regenerative products, that'll give me more confidence to take a risk and maybe have a bit of a leap. Where also now I'm going to start processing our own milk and start providing our own dairy products along that as well. And other things like the cash cropping, though, I'm sure a lot of that would have to necessarily transition over to pasture. So a lot of that row cropping will just disappear and be used. That same acreage will be used as pasture instead for rotational grazing. So but I do intend to continue experimenting with things like row cropping and producing things like corn in a regenerative way. Because yeah, like not everybody's going to eat nothing but dairy and animal products, because like rotationally grazing, applying the principles of regenerative agriculture to rotational grazing is so easy. It almost happens by itself, by accident. As long as you're rotationally grazing, you're naturally following the 5 different principles of soil health. But it becomes more complex. You have to be far more intentional when you're doing row cropping. And it's possible. Like I see a light at the end of the tunnel, and a lot of that is still experimental. Very few people are doing it truly successfully. So I can't just like take what somebody else is doing and just apply it to my farm. I have to really experiment with it personally. And for example, one thing that I'm working towards is something called Johnson Sioux compost. It's a a method of composting where you have zero turn, so that because as soon as you disturb the compost in any way, the fungus will die off. So you can't disturb it, you can't turn it to introduce that oxygen. So you put pipes in, and you have these channels of oxygen where you have constant airflow, and you have it sit and mature for at least a year, and you have a carbon heavy food source of this compost. And at the end, and then also the moisture levels is really, really high. You're creating the ideal environment for fungus, because that's typically the limiting factor in making this whole system work, that for that diversity and getting the benefits from that diversity. So I'm trying to make a real fungal dominant compost. And then what I'm going to do with that is once it's mature, I'll rinse it off. I'll wash the compost because I don't need to add necessarily the organic matter. What I'm after is that microbial life. So I'll rinse off, I'll collect the microbial life, and then I can apply that diversity to the land to kickstart that process, to kickstart and it's almost like a shortcut to beating that addiction to fertilizers. Because what you find in the spring is like you plant your crops, but if you don't fertilize it, you're not going to get any production. It's not going to grow. So how do you start the process towards regeneration? If you do it with rotational grazing, it takes about 3 years to build up that soil health and build up that diversity for things to really start humming. But you don't have 3 years. Every single year, you're planting new crops when in a row crop system. But then every year, you're going over there with your heavy equipment. You might have some weeds pressure, or you might whatever things happen, and you don't have the perfect situation every single year to build it up for that 3-year period. So that adding that diversity with a compost extract, or typically what they call it is a compost tea, is a way to shortcut the whole situation. So it really is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a way to really make a massive improvement to commercial agriculture, because it is attractive for the average farmer to do this if it's proven to work, of course. Like if it's proven to work and there's not the same risk that I'm taking where you're doing all the experiments yourself, there's huge benefits, because fertilizer is crazy expensive. Getting rid of that input cost without sacrificing yield in the meantime is very attractive. So like that is a real way to feed the world with regenerative products. and do it in a way that's cost effective so the average person can still afford it.
Yeah, on our pre-call, you were kind of describing that what's it called, Johnson Sue composting.
Yes.
One of the things you mentioned that I'd love for you to expand on was the amount that you need, which was surprisingly low. So you said you rinse it off, you kind of create this compost tea. How much do you need for, say, 1 acre or 1 hectare, however you want to describe that?
Yeah, that's the beauty of the system is it is very scalable. You only need 1 pound of compost per acre of farmland. That's
Right,
how
that's
close
crazy.
this diversity is. And what you're doing is like to make it to stretch it out that far is you actually put it in while you're planting. You put it in with the seed. You plant the seed, you put the extract with the seed. So like it's a perfect system where you have like a no-till planter or no-till seed drill, and you have the setup for liquid fertilizer. But instead of the liquid fertilizer, you put your liquid compost tea in there, and then you can stretch it
Mm-hmm.
out to that such an extreme to such an extreme degree where this system is very, very scalable.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Just kind of going over some more vocabulary within the regenerative agriculture space for people who may or may not know. Can you describe what tillage is and what no-till operations are, and why tilling might not be, why no-till operations are better for the environment, more beneficial, anything around that realm?
Yeah, tillage is basically when you're turning and moving the soil in any way. So that's usually your mobile plow flipping the earth upside down, or your cultivators that create that seed bed that really makes that fine, loose soil, which is gives like the seed a really easy place to start growing. That's tillage, and it's very detrimental to that microbial diversity because, like I was saying, that microbial life, the fungal life is so sensitive. So as soon as you go in there with any sort of piece of tillage, even the seed drill, when you're planting, will have some impact on the fungal life. It's very, very sensitive. So as soon as you tillage in any way, that the fungal life is gone. You're left with the bacteria. So that's basically the back to the situation where typical commercial agriculture is in, where you have soils that's just microbially the diversity is not there. All you really have is that bacteria. So if you want to make the regenerative management practices work and reap the benefits, not just have the cost of your cover cropping or whatever else, or your new equipment. If you really want to reap the benefits, you kind of have to keep that diversity alive, and you do that by following those 5 principles of soil health. And those principles are: you want to minimize disturbance of any sort, whether it be tillage or even fertilizers or herbicides, pesticides, any sort of disturbance, compaction with large equipment. You want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. And then you also need the biodiversity. I keep talking about the diversity of the microbial life, but just diversity in general, because planting a diverse population of plants attracts diverse microbial life. So, and then also like diverse animals. Each animal has a different style of impact on the environment. So diversity of any kind is important. You need to have living roots in the soil all year round, because all those microbial life, they live in association with living roots. If there's no living roots, there's no base of that food chain. There's no sugars being released into the soil for the whole food chain to grow off of. So you need to have living roots. You need to have armor on the soil, which is basically plants that protect the soil from the sunlight, drying it out and heating it up and making it inhospitable for the microbial life. And the last thing you need is animal impact, which I've talked about quite a bit already. So like those 5 principles is what you need to follow. And and the beautiful thing is, like, you follow all those principles, you follow them naturally when you're doing rotational grazing. But yeah, you have to be much more intentional with other forms of agriculture.
Yeah, I appreciate you running through the 5 principles of soil health, because you mentioned that earlier, so that was going to be a follow up anyway. So I previously had on a guest who said something which, I don't know, may or may not be obvious to people, but I grew up in like rural New Jersey, where, you know, New Jersey is known as the Garden State. So most people think of New Jersey as like Newark, which is not a good representation of it, but we do have lots of gardens and farms in New Jersey. But growing up there, you would see a lot of bare soil once the cash crops were harvested. And I just thought that was normal. And he said it was more in context to carbon capture. He's like, this goes to the idea of cover cropping, which is when you have your cash crop and then you plant other crops in the off season to, help rebalance either the nitrogen in the soil. Basically whatever the cash crop extracted, you want something that's going to help restore the soil. But he was describing it as like bare soil is really, really bad bare soil is really, really bad for that soil health. You need something to help harvest the sunlight. And it was the quote, harvesting sunlight, which is something I'd never heard before, as to, the dirt is just going to dry out and reflect a lot of heat. But when you have these cover crops, you have more leaf coverage, and that can actually absorb the sunlight and capture carbon and put it into the soil to help that regenerative process. So it's just one of those things that, like, I knew soil health was a thing. I'd heard of cover cropping for many years. It just it never clicked, and I never understood why exactly. I was like, I understand that it's a good complementary aspect to the cash crop, but I'd never understood the idea of harvesting sunlight. The more we can plant on this earth that can harvest sunlight, the better it's going to be from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, that's right. Like the harvesting the sunlight, that's basically alluding to the fact that, like, the photosynthesis really is the scientific method where that is needed to sequester that carbon. You need to capture that sunlight, and then through photosynthesis, you create those sugars from CO2 and sunlight, that energy, and then your that carbon that's created, those sugars, that's what fuels the diversity of life, and all that life. Those are all carbon-based life forms, and also just organic matter in general, like the root mass. It's and allowing like when you allow that pasture to recover, it grows above ground, but also below ground. So all of that is basically more and more carbon under the soil and in the soil, and like it's all fueled through photosynthesis. It's fueled through the sunlight, and that's when what you're doing is basically you're using sunlight to capture greenhouse gases, and then you're storing it into the soil.
Right. And so it's not only storage, but it's also beneficial for the soil, for that diversity and that life. And then when you end up tilling soil, as I've come to understand it, a lot of that carbon gets released, and the layers of soil that sort of establish themselves are done in a very intelligent way. Like, nature doesn't work in a haphazard way. So if soil is layered in a particular way, where you have certain microbes here and certain fungi here, all of those things are it happens very deliberately. And by tilling that, you basically just come up and just kind of make a mess of it all. And then we need all these external inputs to make it work again, where regenerative is much more working in line with nature, which is another point that I feel like from a agricultural and farming perspective is kind of has to coincide with a cultural shift as well, where I guess like traditional farming has just been very extractive for so long, where we just extract from the earth to get a product, and then we need another external input just to be able to extract the same thing. And it's very indicative of like Western society, where everything is single use, where we'll just buy something, throw it out, buy another one, throw it out, where nothing really gets reused. And I think there needs to be a shift towards just a more logical way of living, not just from an agriculture standpoint, but also from just a general lifestyle perspective. But just to give people a perspective on how much, at least in the United States, these are numbers I looked up, I think they're from 2022. There's about 900 million acres of farmland in the US, and only about 1.5% of that is being regeneratively farmed. So there's plenty of work to do. I guess that's maybe disappointing, but also like encouraging in that there's still so much, right? Like if we were at like 90% regenerative farming and the climate situation was still exactly where it is today, you'd be like, ooh, there's not much left. That's not a very big lever to pull. But the fact that we are in this position, and there's basically the entire agriculture system that can sort of be revamped in a better way to start capturing more carbon, it's encouraging, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. The thing I wanted to ask was, I guess on a long enough timeline, the answer is yes. But do you think regenerative agriculture is possible for all farms?
Absolutely. It's just more challenging. And it's frustrating from the producer's perspective, because things like cover cropping and like no tillage, Those are all initiatives that have been pushed from the government and through like education and stuff like that. It's been pushed on farmers for quite a long time already, and the results are back. And unfortunately, if you actually look at the research of the benefits of things like cover cropping or no till, they're abysmal. Like there's very, very to no return as far as organic matter increases. Like it's very disappointing. And like these farmers every single year they're buying the extra seeds, they're putting in the fuel cost to put it in or paying the custom worker to put that into the soil. And like you're trying to do it right by your land and be a good steward. Unfortunately, after all those investments, there's very little return. There's very little to show for it. And the reason is because unfortunately, you kind of have to get all the puzzle pieces together at the same time to maintain and even get or even attract that microbial diversity and maintain it from year to year to year. Like you have to get all these puzzle pieces in place and maintain them, which is really difficult to do in reality, which is kind of like where I was talking before, like where the compost tea can improve things dramatically when things don't go perfect according to the plan, which things rarely do in agriculture. You can kickstart the whole system, the whole process again, that diversity every single year and boost it. So like, yeah, it's very challenging, but not impossible. And I've it's something that I'm working towards myself as well. I have my own challenges. Like I don't have equipment for planting. We specialized years ago towards a dairy farm, just like your typical commercial farm. We specialize. We don't have equipment for planting, and even for tillage we don't do because we do mostly no-till. So like I can't ask a custom worker to go like, hey, can you do a little test strip here where you do it this way, and then another test strip over here where you do it a little bit different. Like he's in a hurry. He's got more customers than just myself. He has to get our fields done and he's off to the next farmer. So he doesn't have the time or the patience to do all these little different tests that I want to experiment with to try out these compost teas and these different ways of managing it and cover crops and whatever else. So like it's not unsurmountable though. So like what we did is like we bought a bunch of this garden equipment where we have like little hand seeders and stuff like that. We own 700 acres, but a portion of that we're going to be planting by hand. So like that's the solution that we're moving towards, just to get some data back of like how well does this work? How heavily can we invest in this? Like, does it make sense for us to make this massive investment into a giant no-till seed drill or to really do this on a large scale on our farm? And then like once we get there, like it's just step by step, right? Like you can't take too big of a risk because we still have to make the payments to the bank. So like we take step by step, and then um it's going to happen. Because like the benefits of regenerative agriculture are massive for everybody. Everybody wins basically. The animals win, the consumer wins, the farmer wins. Like the animals have improved welfare, the consumer has more nutrient dense food, the farmer decreased costs. Like there's a crazy stat. Like if you look at corn produced 50, 100 years ago, or whatever, the yield has increased dramatically, but the profit per acre has plummeted. So basically, the farmers, they are required to get bigger and bigger and do more and more acres just to scrape by, because the profitability per acre is so low. Like when they first introduced fertilizer, nitrogen, urea, like the increased yield that it gave you was great for the farmer. Urea or the nitrogen was cheap. The increase in yield was great. Farmers made more money, but over time, the cost of the fertilizer and the herbicides and the pesticides and everything else that are required now because you started down this road, all those inputs costs have increased to the point where it's like, yeah, you're not really making much money. So like it dramatically benefits the farmer as well to move towards regenerative agriculture. So I'm convinced that it's going to happen even without people pushing it forwards, because it makes so much sense. It just, yeah, like, and like as soon as some people start cracking that code, farmers will learn from each other and customers will appreciate those products. So like it'll be clear that there's demand for it. And then it's just a matter of time. Like people need to do those experiments and run those, and then farmers need to learn from each other. But I'm convinced it's going to happen.
Yeah, like you alluded to this earlier, where you're saying that everything is shifted towards specialization, and like it's not just in agriculture, like that's happened kind of everywhere in industry. So, and then you said it's almost required that you be more of a generalist in the regenerative space, and then also the requirement that at least for soil health, having animals involved, right?
Yeah.
So like if people are just monocropping, or you already mentioned sort of the beef like track that happens in a regular commercial sense, there's like three hops from or three different farmers involved. So I feel like at some point it's probably going to have to be like diversification amongst these big groups that are really specialized, where it's like we're going to need some cattle over here just to start doing anything for the soil, where it doesn't seem like it can happen independently of each other. And I don't necessarily know that that's a bad thing, that there's going to need to be collaboration. I think it's going to be a requirement kind of going forward.
I think the collaboration is a key word, because like one push will be towards generalization for farmers, but these huge farms that have their hands full just with their silo
Yep.
of product that they're producing, collaboration will be key to growing the regenerative space in that like for those kind of farms as well, where like you'll have in areas where like all you see is cash crop and monocrops and stuff like that, there'll be such a demand for somebody to produce beef in that area, because if everybody
Yep.
starts seeing the benefits of cover cropping and having animals graze that and what it does to the soil health, then like at the start, if people are desperate enough, basically that beef farmer can almost feed his cows for free. Like it'll
For
be,
free. Yep.
yeah, like that'll be amazing for the beef farmer. So like then it's like it'll introduce these collaborations, like you said, where yeah, like where all these different farmers can benefit from each other, and that'll I feel like that is the direction that agriculture is going to go. That's where the future is heading.
Good. Okay. So I think we've hammered this side of regenerative agriculture, as far as like from your side of it, essentially. I'd like to shift a little bit towards the consumer side. You've already mentioned that consumers are just going to buy the cheapest thing, right? So I'd love to hear from your perspective, as far as like finding buyers from a marketing perspective. What are your biggest hurdles? What can people be doing to help drive this in a better direction from a consumer standpoint? Just kind of understanding, like, I understand, or hopefully we have a better understanding of how things need to shift on the industry side. What about on the consumer side? Like where do you think things need to happen? Where can initiatives be taken by the people who are in a position to make that move earlier, right? Obviously, food insecurity is a huge issue, at least here in America, where it's like 1 out of 8 people are food insecure. So they're probably not the people who are going to be driving the shift towards regenerative agriculture from a consumer standpoint. But there are plenty of people here who do have money and can afford it. So I'd love to know from your perspective, like where do consumer behaviors need to change?
Yeah, the beautiful thing about this change from the consumer perspective is that they have a tool that's so powerful and so simple to follow, that and that is by leveraging supply and demand to create change. It is the most powerful way to create change in agriculture. It's not by posting angry comments on social media. It's not by protesting at the government gates. It's simply by using your food dollars to vote for the agriculture system that you want to see in the future. It's that simple. And it's so powerful, because once farmers are that are producing and doing these are stretching out and trying to make these initiatives and create these healthier, newer products, they're rewarded for that. Well, then other farmers will copy that. They'll learn from that, and also the farmers that started it, they'll grow. So it's like they're farming. Like for me, for example, it'll grow within my own operation as far as like how much of it is regenerative versus commercial, but it would also allow me to profit and do well to the point where I can just grow my whole farm. My whole farm can grow, and then neighbors will notice that, like, this, he's trying these crazy things, but he seems to be doing well. So then they'll start asking questions, and they'll start adopting some of these practices as well. So like it's crazy how much power the consumer really truly has. Whereas like instead of saying I want the cheapest thing, I don't care if it's 5 cents cheaper, I just want the cheapest thing, versus I want the best thing for my health. I want the thing that's going to give me a lot of the vitality that I'm after, and like that'll allow me to raise my kids in a healthy way. Like if you start changing what you prioritize when you're grocery shopping, that is the biggest and most powerful impact that you can have on agriculture. And that's what I always try to drive home to people, is like it is very, very powerful. The impact that you can have just through supply and demand.
So do you have any tips on people being able to identify where their food dollars should be going? Because most people are just going to be going to a grocery store, right? Are there easy things that you can point out to be understanding like this is coming from a regenerative farm versus this is not?
Yeah, unfortunately, when you go to grocery stores, there are things you can do, the recommendation I always give when it comes to grocery store is like you eat the whole foods. 83% of a grocery store is highly processed junk, and you want to avoid those. That's not rocket science. But beyond that, once you make that big leap to for your health, yeah, then you start asking for things like organic or grass fed, grass finished, or process as little as possible, like if you do some raw dairy or whatever like that. Those are all benefits towards your health, and typically towards soil health as well, because they go hand in hand. The health of the food and the health of the soil and the health for your own body, it all comes together. But unfortunately, there's only so far you can go in a grocery store because you're relying on labels, and labels are usually started and initiated and with the best intentions. But over time, what always happens is that once you have a label, you have a list of criteria that the farmer needs to follow, and within those list of criteria, there's always loopholes, and you end up having food that's produced with not necessarily the goals that the initial people had in mind when they created this label. So, and that will always happen. So, like the best thing you can do when you really want regenerative food of any sort is to buy it directly from a farmer. Have a relationship with a farmer, get to know the farmer, whether it be through social media or directly by shaking his hand. That is the truest way to ensure that your products are produced in a way that you want food to be produced. That's the way you want agriculture to produce food in the future, is by actually buying it directly from the farmer. And then like the farmer benefits more that way too, because there's less people in the middle. And so like there's less people with their hands in the pockets trying to make a little profit here and there.
Is there a good website that like aggregates a lot of regenerative farms, or is it just kind of looking in your area? Obviously, we're going to link to your website in the show notes and description, but are there any resources you can point to, or any other farms? Like I'm not sure if it's kind of pointing people to the competition, but are there any other good farms that you know of that you want to shout out? If not, no problem.
No, absolutely. From the consumer's perspective, there's some very easy places you can start, like the farmers markets. Most cities have farmers markets. That's a great place to start. You can get to know some farmers that go there, and you can even ask those farmers who else they know that can produce a product that you're looking for that they maybe don't provide. Like farmers market is a good place to start. It's really easy, but if you don't want to spend the time shopping in a farmers market, you can use businesses like Butcher Box or True Local is something that is available in our area. NICU Farms, I think, is another one that started up. They source from farmers that are usually doing things like organic or grass fed, or you can choose basically on their shopping website what kind of things that you would like. That's a good place to start. But like this is still not perfect, but it's a step above the grocery store, because there's only at least one step between your food and the person who produced it. But like ultimately, like just doing a quick Google search will get you surprisingly far. If you Google grass fed meat near me, you're likely going to find a regenerative farmer near you. Like and then you can contact them. And then the same thing again, if he doesn't produce everything that you like, or doesn't produce it in a way, you can always ask him, like, who else do you know that produces food this way, or also produces this product that you don't provide? Who else do you recommend that does things in a regenerative way? So like that's a real easy way to you have to do a little more research. You have to reach out to these farmers, but they'd be more than happy to explain how they produce their food, who else they know, and then also you can search on social media. So you can search on Instagram and TikTok or whatever social media you like, YouTube, and you can find farms. It's just they might not be as local to you as if you were to do a Google search, but you can get really far that way too.
Yeah, farmers markets are great. And one of the other things I want to call out is at least here in Phoenix, I'm sure once you sort of start looking at these things, you start getting more plugged into that scene. You start discovering, oh, there's actually a lot of options that do make it convenient because, it can be annoying. Be like, oh, I get my meat and eggs from the farmer's market. Then I need to go to the grocery store to get all the vegetables that I want. But at least here in Phoenix, there is a group that does aggregation from a bunch of the farms for produce. And then you can just shop bags that you want. You can be like, I get a $25 weekly bag. I get a $35 weekly produce bag, and you know approximately what's going to be in there. And then you can either get it delivered or you can pick it up at the farmer's market. So you don't need to go around shopping, picking up all these things. It's a quick pickup service that they offer, and they aggregate these things from a bunch of different farms. So once you start looking into these things, you start discovering it's like there are a lot of people working to make this more accessible to the masses, not necessarily at the grocery store level of convenience, but at least one step closer than having to go individually source all these things by yourself. But yeah, farmers market is a great option. Hey everyone, that's all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for stopping by and watching, especially if you've made it all the way to this point. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes are going to be released, feel free to subscribe and make sure you hit the bell button as well. To learn more about today's guest, feel free to look in the description. You can also visit the podcast website, which is exploringhealthpodcast.com. That website will also be linked in the description. As always, likes, shares, comments are a huge help to me and to this channel and to the show. So any of that you can do, I would really appreciate. And again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.